Hi there, everybody, and welcome to CAKEPOPS. I am here with the wonderful Wendy Xu. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Wendy. I live in Brooklyn. Um, I am a cartoonist, an illustrator, and a writer of graphic novels and short comics. Um, Most of my published work is for kids, which is why we are here today.
Yeah,
My stories are mostly focused on using fantasy and sci-fi to explore kind of the deeper truths about, what it means to be alive, what it means to be a kid, what it means to grow up. Um, and I really enjoy the metaphor of sci-fi fantasy, which is why I choose to feature it so prominently in my work.
that's actually, I wanted to ask you what drew you to making kids comics in the first place. I feel like, especially indie comics, I feel like a lot of people skew more towards adults. So what drew you to making kids comics?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Um I feel like my stories tend to skew very like teenager-y because when I was a teen, when I was in middle school and high school, those were some really, I mean, they were formative years for everyone, right? But they were especially formative for me because I think during that time was when I realized what I was really passionate about for the first time, which was writing and drawing. When I was in high school, like freshman year, I feel like that was when this dream of being a writer and an artist really got cemented. And it's interesting because I'm going to get a little personal, but it was the time that it was like falling in love twice. Like I fell in love with a person, but I also fell in love with the stories and the work that I was making like with this person. We were collaborating on a lot of stuff and we were writing this like what I still think it's an amazing fantasy novel. Like going back and rereading it, I was like, there's some really great themes in here. Um, but it's that feeling of falling in love twice. It's that feeling of falling in love with a person who really sees you for the first time, who really sees like your creative potential and really thinks that your work is amazing, and that your art is amazing. And it's also the feeling of just falling in love with making the work.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that's what it's like, this feeling that has carried me through to this day. Like it's like a little special memory that I look at whenever I am trying to really figure out like what is my work about, like what is my art about. It's like this little special memory that I open up from like a little treasure box in my heart.
That's so sweet. Is that a work that you ever plan on on revisiting? Because you said you liked a lot of the themes that were in it.
I you know I will definitely, like, I'll take names from it. I'll take names from the work. I don't think that book is ever going to be, published in any form because it was such a collaborative work. It was like a novel that was written back and forth on AOL Instant Messenger.
That's amazing.
There were no, without Google Docs, like all we had was AOL Instant Messenger and we would just copy and paste like paragraphs
That's
into MS
incredible.
Word, right? Like, but yeah, it was a story about a princess who and a high priest. So these are like themes that I kind of like. These are themes that I would like to revisit in my work. But it was a story about a princess and a high priest and a rebel. And the princess who becomes part of a rebellion to overthrow like the suppressive regime from her father. The high priest who is, it's unclear if he's in love with her, if he's just like obsessed with power, which I was such a great character study. That
Yeah.
was like
Especially at such a young age, like exploring those kind of mature themes.
yeah, that was the character that was mostly like came up with and written by like that person I was in love with at the time. And there was also like a rebel leader who was like, I was like, yeah, she's gonna be really old, she's gonna be like 30.
The oldest.
She's gonna be so old. She has a scar across her nose. She's like, you know, like battle weary, and she teams up with like an exiled general that the emperor like betrays. So the high priest frames the general for like a murder, and the general is exiled, and he wakes up with all of his memories kind of gone because he's been beaten up.
This, like, this feels so much like something I would have been into as a kid. Like,
right?
wanted to make, like.
It's such a, like, rereading passages, like, sure, it wasn't like amazingly written, but it was the passion behind it, the passion of just like being a kid and being really invested in all of these themes that I think people don't give teens and kids enough credit for, you know, what they're interested in.
Absolutely. Yeah. Karl Barks famously said, like, you know, don't talk down to kids, don't talk down to your audiences. Which brings me to my next question. Tide Song explores complicated family dynamics, including generational trauma. Is it important to include these kinds of mature themes in kids' media?
Yes, absolutely. I think that, you know, children can handle a lot more than what a lot of people think they can handle. Excuse me, but also that I think it's really important to show relationships between generations, period. I've never really jived with the idea that like the hero's journey, you know, where the trope in the hero's journey where the old mentor kind of dies or is devastated and has to pass down everything to the hero, and then the hero's on their own, right? Like in the stories that I grew up with, and you know, in a lot, like I just finished this drama recently that I've been obsessed with called Ashes of Love. But I'm struck, but like this is a storytelling kind of not trope, sensibility, I guess, in the stuff that I grew up with, that you interact with your elders, like not, you know, you choose, well, like you take lessons that they've taught you, you take all this conditioning that you've been raised to believe in, and you challenge it, or you fall prey to like the same cycle, or like it's like as a young person we all inherit things that we are, that at that age, like the main character in Tide Song, you know, she's 12, but I feel like at that age is when we really begin to come into this question of who am I as a person. But no one is like raised in a vacuum, right? So you are always raised by either, you know, adopted family or blood family, and you have to really answer that question, who am I in the dynamic of my family, but who am I in the dynamic of a wider society? And I think it's really important to explore these themes. All like it's something that I kind of gravitate naturally towards, but it was present in all of the great stories that a lot of the great stories that I grew up reading. So I feel like it's a continuation of that work and those sensibilities. But yeah.
So what would you say is the main difference in writing for kids versus writing for adults, besides the obvious?
Yeah, you know, I haven't explored a whole lot of adult works. I feel like it varies in cultural contexts. Like,
Mhm.
for example, the drama I finished that I'm just gonna keep talking about because I'm obsessed with it. But I feel like even though it was marketed towards adults and we would recognize it as an adult show, like the themes in that drama are so YA.
Mhm. That's
Um,
how I feel about like Inuyasha specifically, like has a lot of mature themes and like mature moments, but is marketed to kids. Like it's yeah.
yeah, I think that I don't know. I think it's so arbitrary.
Mhm.
You know, I never want to talk down to the audience. I feel like as a young person, I read a lot of adult stuff. Um,
Yeah,
and
same.
yeah, that just totally informs my sensibility. Like my students, because I also teach middle and high school creative writing. My students also read a lot of adult fiction. Um, and I feel like every time I speak to students, they're always reading older. So
Really?
yeah, I think our idea of what is appropriate for which age group is all a matter of just arbitrary marketing, because like kids will find whatever they want, whether it's like marketed to them or not, and they'll pick it up and they'll read it, and if it's not for them, they'll put it down and walk away.
That's true. Yeah, they would just get bored.
Yeah. um
I can't imagine like a 10-year-old enjoying Cormac McCarthy.
I feel like maybe the biggest difference in making things for kids versus making things for adults is that I don't know, this is something I'm gonna have to go back to, because in my mind there's no like hard boundary.
Mhm.
There is just um there is just me, actually. There literally is just, in my mind, it's like, would I have enjoyed this as a 15-year-old? Would I have enjoyed this as a 12-year-old? And I just kind of go from from there.
I think that's really smart though, like looking through your own personal lens and personal experience to like inform how you write, essentially. Like, yeah, because it makes for honest storytelling.
Yeah, and for Tide Salt specifically, it's like, would I have liked this as an 8-year-old?
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the differences between working with Suzanne Walker for Mooncakes and then by yourself for Tide Song?
Yeah, sure. For Mooncakes, I was I mean, I had a lot of input into how the story was going to go, but I was given a script to work off of. So I looked at the script, I gave my input, but I also provided like, kind of like minor like edits if a panel had too much dialogue in it. I would just like make a note that says like split the panel into two. um a lot of it was uh a lot of it was not just like about creative collaboration. It was also like just kind of figuring out the logistics of how that art was going to go. For Tide Song, I felt like the process was very organic. Like the way I approached it, I kind of thumbnailed and wrote at the same time. So how dialogue would fit and how the art would flow, like with or without dialogue. Those were all things that happened a little more, I guess, organically instead of
Mhm.
kind of going back and forth.
And yeah, I wanted to ask you, like, you work on graphic novels like really consistently. What kind of is the day in the life of a graphic novelist?
Oh my God. So every year when hourly comics day rolls around, I always feel so ashamed because I don't get up that early.
Yeah,
I
everybody gets up at like 6 a.m. and I'm like, "Ah."
know I see all these beautiful hours and I really enjoy reading them. I really, really enjoy reading them and seeing everybody else's schedules. But I was like, wow, I'm like too ashamed to do an hourly because of my schedule. I wake up and Sorry, that's the work guys.
Oh,
If
it's okay. It's
yeah,
okay.
if they have to leave, we can reshoot. I wake up. I will not disclose the time. I make lunch, and I do this thing where if I'm making dinner that day, I will prep stuff like as I'm prepping lunch, so that saves me a little bit of time and cleaning, like cutting boards and stuff. I will eat lunch, breakfast, and then I fire up a podcast, or I fire up a drama or a YouTube video, just to have a little bit of background noise, and I will get to work.
So I do want to talk a little bit about your influences for your books. I know you talked about like a lot of your childhood experiences. What else influences your comics?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I read a lot of nonfiction. My interests are all over the place, but they range from like fiction about the natural world. I really love learning about like I was on a really big fungi kick a couple of years ago, so I just like tried to learn everything I could. I routinely attend Dr. Rebecca Helm's talks. She does like Twitter blasts for when she's doing it's called Nature for Creatives. And she's a marine biologist by trade, so she just talks about cool sea creatures for an hour, and people ask, and she shows us slides and people ask questions, and it's just like a really fun time to like learn about all the weird deep sea things. Yeah, it's so fun, and she's so enthusiastic. She studies specifically like jellyfish, and I really love and appreciate science educators who make their work fun and accessible for people, because like I'm always looking for cool stuff for creature design.
Yeah.
And so like, you know, when she shows us like little sea slugs that look like bunnies, or like weird things that look like face crawlers, it's like, that's really awesome. I try to take from sources that are like, I try not to only consume fiction.
Mhm.
I choose the fiction that I look at I'm very picky about the kind of fiction that I read and watch. I love like Chinese fantasy dramas, just because I grew up with those, but those are very long series. So in my everyday life, like a lot of the podcasts I put on when I'm working, or when mostly when I'm working, have to do with nature, and I also listen to audiobooks. So I'm currently listening to an audiobook on like human evolution from like prehistory, by David Graeber and David Wengrow, called The Dawn of Everything, or something. I can look it up later if you guys want the title. But I listen to like Tides of History, which is a podcast by Patrick Wyman, and he really goes in depth at like the last 2 years he's been doing this like really big in depth on prehistory all over the world. So that's just been so fascinating to learn about. And I watched like, I don't know, like Werner Herzog made a volcano documentary on Netflix, and that was just so cool. Like I love watching like random documentaries, and I'm also really into like exposés on like scammers and cults.
Oh, me too. The Hustlers series on HBO Max. I was like,
I have to check that out. I've been listening to Scotchy and Sarah Hagi have a podcast called Scamfluencers that I was listening to. That it's super fun. But yeah,
listen to Scam Goddess.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, I love Scam Goddess.
Scam Goddess. But yeah, so those are I feel like real life is just so much weirder than fiction sometimes. Like you can't make this shit up.
Oh, absolutely. Like,
And
and oh, sorry, go
oh
ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, it's super duper interesting how you take so many influences from not only like your individual life, but from nature. And like, yeah, I just think that's really cool.
Thank you. I love nature. I love like being in nature when I can because the middle of New York City. But yeah, like I took a foraging class a couple of years ago in the middle of the pandemic. That was really fun. And it's just like really neat when you go out and you're like, oh, I can identify like what this plant is.
Yeah, I can safely eat this magnolia flower petal.
Yes. Um, it's really cool to be able to touch something and look at something and smell something. And I think the more you experience life, the more organic your work becomes, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so I hear you're working on a new graphic novel. Do you want
Yes.
to talk about it?
Yeah. So my new graphic novel, release date TBD, hopefully next year, is called The Infinity Particle. Um, and speaking of research, I did so much research for this book because it's a sci-fi about a girl and an AI who fall in love. And
A tale as old as time.
a tale as old as time. Like I have a pin from I think Rebecca Farrow that says like heart heart robots or something.
Oh,
um and it's got a lot of the themes that I kind of gravitate towards, which are, romance. But also I did a lot of research into contemporary tech culture to make this book. I listened to a podcast called Tech Won't Save Us, hosted by Paris Marks. Just a lot of really interesting stuff in like what billionaires think that tech will do versus what like it's actually capable of. And I also interviewed one of my neuroscience professors at NYU about machine learning and AI because he studies data science and he studies perception.
oh, interesting.
So it was really cool to kind of get his take. And that's where I learned that the way AI evolves, like not even neuroscience knows how certain kinds of AI evolve, which is terrifying, but also just like so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, because originally I had no idea how I was gonna write like this robot character and like this there's like lots of ways in which robots have been written throughout, sci-fi history. And like starting with like, iRobot
Yeah.
and then kind of going through like Blade Runner, and contemporary depictions of robots and like Ex Machina and stuff like that. But what I find really interesting is like not necessarily like how does a machine have feelings, because I don't think it's like insane to say that like a machine will eventually have feelings or like,
Yeah.
but that a machine's feelings are different from human feelings in certain ways, but that makes it like no less valid.
Yeah. Like how you know about Bunny, the dog that presses the buttons to talk.
Yeah.
So they've recently done research about how cats use the buttons versus dogs, and it really shows like their differences in thinking and feeling. Um,
Oh, interesting.
yeah, like dogs tend to use more words to convey things, where cats will gravitate towards singular words or like a maximum of three to express what they want. Um, and yeah, what you're saying kind of reminds me of that, like how there are differences in how creatures and AI would feel things versus how humans see and feel feelings.
Yeah, and I think that ultimately this book, because a lot of it was written like during the pandemic, kind of became about how do we treat living things that are different, that like are so inherently different from us, but how do we, I mean, but like the way that, you know, the way that workers get treated in these facilities, like these tech facilities like Amazon, for example, um it's so dehumanizing, and like they are the de facto, you know, they are treated like robots.
Yeah.
But they like, but they're human beings, and it's a lot about like how we see kind of the different ways that we see like being human, and the different ways we engage with like other forms of consciousness.
Yeah. That's so
Um,
interesting.
thank you. I don't know how much I have succeeded, but I brought a lot of love into it, so I hope it shows through. And I
Well,
hope,
given how amazing your other books are, I feel confident in saying that I think you succeeded already without.
oh my god, thank you. But yeah, aesthetically, I brought in a lot of nature motifs, a lot of kind of to visualize the data flows and stuff. I kind of tried to use like I was inspired by seeing mycologist scans of like fungi roots, or like the ways in which fungi roots intertwine with plant roots, and how like mycelium grows. I was inspired by that, like aesthetically. I was inspired um, by street food stalls. Because there's like,
That's awesome.
it takes place on a city on Mars. And a lot of it is also, I think reading through it, it's become like a love letter to like public works. Like they go to a museum, they go to a library, they're on a train. So like a lot of it is about like being part of like society, you know?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
like having that like public free infrastructure to exist in society, right? Like without having to, going to a library is free. You don't need to, pay X amount to have access to all that knowledge.
Right.
And that's something that like I grew up poor, so that's something I think about a lot. Yeah, that's awesome. I can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
um, Lastly, is there any advice that you have for people wanting to get into KidLit?
Um, well, my first piece of advice is like never talk down to your audience. I think a lot of children's books become preachy instead of being about the story. And while I think it's okay, like some of my like Philip Pullman wrote some of my favorite children's books of all time that had a really big impact on me as a teenager, and they're quite moralistic. He's a teacher like by trade, like he was an English teacher for so many years, and I'm a teacher, so I definitely understand kind of that sensibility of wanting to impart something on a young reader. And I do, part of me does want to impart it, but like there's a part of me that kind of tries to hold myself back from becoming too preachy, because I want kids to find their own meaning in the story. So that's like that's one thing. The other thing is, never, a lot of it just is never underestimate your audience. You're writing for kids, but you have to give it your all. I certainly I'm trying to put my best work forward for kids, because I think they deserve beautiful art. I think they deserve complicated art. And I think they deserve stories that challenge them to think. Yeah. And just because it's written in a certain way, just because the audience is like is being marketed, it's being marketed towards them, it's being marketed it's not even being marketed towards them, it's being marketed towards the parents. Like, let's be real, if we're writing for like
Yeah.
children. But you know, the story is always gonna, the story comes first. The story, like the marketing comes second. You know, I don't sit down and say like, I don't sit down and say, oh, I'm gonna write like a middle grade, so it has to have like XYZ.
Mm-hmm.
There's some ideas that I'm like, it starts out as I think like, okay, well, this like thematically now it sounds like a middle grade, but what if I took it in this direction? Like, it's I try not to lose curiosity when I'm crafting stories, because sometimes it'll work better as like if I age up the characters, it'll be more interesting like in this way. Or if I start off as like a YA, and I think maybe this is better suited for like a younger audience thematically.
And is that something that you work with your publisher to figure out, or is that something you work with your agent while pitching it?
Both. Sometimes I mean, luckily the two books that I have sold to my publisher were very solidly like, okay, this is a middle grade, okay, this is a young adult. But in the future, I definitely, I want their feedback, mostly because they're working with me on like how to get it out there, right?
Yeah.
And I definitely value their feedback. But as far as like my own self-published works go, I try not to like put that label. Like, if you're self-publishing, like, why put that label?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Because anyone who stumbles across your work is gonna, regardless of age, is gonna be like, oh, I like Wendy's work. This is self-published by Wendy. That's an author I can trust. I know I'm gonna like this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I think it's so important for anyone just wanting to be in kids comics, period, to just like self-publish first. Just to give yourself the sense of like what it feels like to have total creative control before other cooks come into the kitchen. And to figure out like what parts are you willing to kind of compromise on, or willing to kind of bend a little bit more on, versus what parts you really, really want to keep.
Yeah, sort of a pick your battles.
Yeah.
And any last thoughts? Any last final words?
Self-publish before you try to pitch, before you start trying to get into publishing, period. It's really important to know how to, for example, just print your own zine, and to figure out what it means to like work with a printer, and to figure out logistics for like this like design specs and stuff, like what size you want to print at. Like, all those things are really important, and you'll save the designer you're working with. Ostensibly, it helps everybody if the more you know what you're doing, the more it helps other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and again, like, creative control is really important. You don't, like, the publisher will decide what age group it belongs in, but like if you're, you won't know, you won't know what work you want to make unless you sit down and make it without anyone interfering, right? So
yeah. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us, and this has been amazing. Where can people find you? Where can people support you?
Oh, thank you. I am on Instagram as Art of Wendy Xu, XU. I am on Twitter as Angry Girl Comics, and I'm on my website at it's www.artofwendyxu.com. Those are the three places you will find me, and you'll find my work and announcements about upcoming stuff.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yay, thank you, Sage. This was great. Okay.
Thank you so much for watching Cake Pops. Cake is a volunteer-run nonprofit organization. Your tax-deductible support is vital to our financial stability and growth. If you'd like to learn more about Cake or consider donating, you can do so at cakechicago.com.